second speaker is Josefine Langer Shohat. Josefine is a PhD candidate at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and currently she's in Israel at the Hebrew University as a Minerva Fellow. Her dissertation project examines the transnational network of Holocaust researchers in Europe and Israel between 1945 and the early 1960s. And before she came to Israel, she has been a fellow in many different and distinguished fellowships, foundations, such as the GHI in London, the Ernst Ludwig Ehrlich, the Ehrlich PhD fellow at the GHI, German Historical Institute in London, and she had received her BA in Berlin from the Humboldt University. And her, do you have a presentation?
Yes. It's called Translating German Studies.
Yes. This one?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So, Josephine, please.
So, thank you also from my side of things for inviting me to speak at this conference, and also for all of you to coming to this afternoon, early evening panel. So in my talk today, I would like to focus on two unique German institutions, the Wiener Library in London and the Institute for Contemporary History, the Institute for Zeitgeschichte in Munich. Their relationship in the 1950s, and especially the plan to jointly publish a book on the persecution of the Jews during National Socialism. The shared interest of both institutions from their respective founding years was to research National Socialism, to collect archival material and publications from and about this period of German history, and to contribute to the research field by publishing their own journals, the Wiener Library Bulletin and the Vierteljahrshefte für Zeitgeschichte, respectively. In the early 1950s, both institutions joined forces to publish a book on the persecution of Jews, Judenverfolgung, a project called Dokumentenwerk or Dokumentationswerk by those involved, since the book was supposed to be based primarily on documents. After almost a decade and many lengthy correspondences, this project failed and is very little known today. In order to understand this relationship and to explain why the Wiener Library and the Institute for Contemporary History established such a close contact, and also why their project failed, I think it is important to look at the history of both institutions, their stance towards the respective other, and what it represented for them. Since it is the focus of my research, and also because its history dates back many more years than that of the Institute for Contemporary History, I will speak in some more detail about the Wiener Library. Both institutions are, or were at least, in a sense deeply German. The Wiener Library was founded by the Potsdam-born Alfred Wiener, a proud Prussian, German patriot and conservative until the end of his life. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this makes a difference. So he was, yes, a proud Prussian, German patriot and conservative until the end of his life, and a strong believer in a Germany that was different from the Nazis, from the one that Nazis had imagined. He believed in German values, German culture, and spoke and wrote German all his life. That Wiener had to leave his homeland, his Heimat, as he would have put it, was because many Germans did not consider him as German as he thought of himself. That was, of course, because Wiener was not only German but also Jewish. Where is this? Yeah, here. Here you can see him. Closely linked to the history of the Wiener Library, which today exists both here on campus and, as many of you know, in London, is the life of its founder, Wiener. Here you can see the two Wiener libraries in Tel Aviv, here around the corner, and in London. Born in 1885 in Potsdam, Wiener studied Jewish theology and later Oriental studies in Berlin and Heidelberg, and earned his PhD on a subject related to Arabic literature in 1911. After serving in the First World War, for him a patriotic duty, he started publishing for the Zentralverein für deutsche Staatsbürger jüdischen Glaubens and wrote a pamphlet called Vorpogrom in 1919. In it, he appealed to the patriotic feelings of his German compatriots. The fight against anti-Semitism was, in Wiener's opinion, an act of patriotism. This was a stance shared by many of the members of the Zentralverein, where Wiener became a syndicus, a leading figure in the 1920s. It is at Zentralverein that Wiener got involved in the secret Büro Wilhelmstrasse, which was responsible for both the collection of Nazi material and anti-Nazi propaganda. After fleeing Germany in 1933, together with his family, Wiener founded the Jewish Central Information Office, or JCIO, in Amsterdam. Here, he and a very small team of co-workers started collecting any information and publication they could get hold of on National Socialism, fascism, and anti-Semitism in Germany and Europe. They collected newspapers, journals, books, pamphlets, but also, for example, Nazi board games. Because of the early founding date, 1933 or 34, the Wiener Library is today considered the oldest library and archive of the Holocaust. Here you can see a collection of the books, and this is from a publication in 1946. In 1938, Wiener decided to move his library to London because of the looming war. On a personal level, though, the family seemed to have believed that it was better for Wiener's wife, Margarete, and the children to stay in Amsterdam even after Wiener had moved to London. They were eventually taken to Westerbork in June 1943 and later deported to Bergen-Belsen. When the war broke out, the JCIO opened it as Wiener's Library in London, where it continued to provide information based on its collection to the Allied governments and to researchers. During the war years, Wiener spent time in New York, where he continued his collection efforts. It was here that he was reunited with his daughters after the war. His wife, Margarete, had passed away shortly after the liberation from Bergen-Belsen. After the war, a time of crisis began for Wiener and his colleagues. Whereas the collection was needed by the Allies during the war and a certain amount of funding was guaranteed, in the aftermath of the war, there was uncertainty both regarding the funding and the content of the library's collection. Although Wiener managed to receive funding shortly after, the work of his library remained precarious during and after Wiener's lifetime. In the aftermath of the war, Wiener and his staff were part of a very unique German Jewish community in London, composed mainly of Jewish refugees of German or Austrian descent, some of which you can see in this picture. Wiener himself, like many refugees, became a British citizen in 1946. In the late 1940s, and especially from the early 1950s onwards, Wiener and his colleagues established an impressive wide range of contacts all over the world. Thousands of letters sent to and received from Europe, the Americas, and Israel that are archived at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London today prove just how well connected Wiener and his staff members were. The counterparts were other scholars and intellectuals, politicians, and religious figures, among them many famous figures of the 20th century. One of Wiener's main interests was the establishment of contacts with other scholars interested in the Holocaust. Even before the term became common among experts and laypeople alike, Wiener tried, as other Jewish early Holocaust researchers did during that time, to put the many pieces of information together in order to understand what had happened, who was involved, and how the different victim groups reacted towards the attempt of complete destruction. Wiener therefore got in touch with those who, like him, were interested in researching the Holocaust, but also National Socialism more broadly. One of them was the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, which continues to exist to this day and which moved to its current premises in the 1980s. Founded in 1949, the Institute's goal was to research National Socialism and to come to terms with Germany's recent past, the first of its kind in Germany. Different from all the Jewish historical commissions that were created during the last years of the war or shortly after, the Institute's focus was not the destruction of European Jewry, but National Socialism, a perspective that primarily focused on perpetrators or Germans in resistance. Its staff members were non-Jewish Germans, and some of them had been NSDAP members during National Socialism. After some uncertainty regarding the Institute's funding, the federal German state and the Bavarian state guaranteed their financial support from 1950 onwards. Since 1952, it bears its current name. It was during that time that Wiener corresponded with his colleague Louis de Jong, a Dutch Jew and head of the Rijksinstituut voor Oorlogsdocumentatie in Amsterdam, about the institute's staff members wondering whether they were Nazis. After a visit to Munich, de Jong concluded they were not, but still, quote, German nationalists like most Germans still are, unquote. Still, both de Jong and Wiener established and maintained contact with the institute during the upcoming years. Both participated in the conference on resistance in 1956, and de Jong published a German translation of one of his books with them. Wiener, for his part, started corresponding with the institute early onwards and took a great interest in their work. The correspondence with the institute's mostly male staff members began with the for Wiener usual exchange of their respective publications, books, and all kinds of information. In addition, Wiener got involved in the planning of a book on German Jewry commissioned by the German Interior Ministry and the newly founded Federal Agency for Home Service and Civic Education, Bundeszentrale für Heimatdienst back then and later for politische Bildung. The planning was the outcome of a conference about how to counter anti-Semitism in the German town Bad Godesberg in 1952. The first meeting took place in February 1954. From the invitation to the meeting, it becomes clear that the Dokumentationswerk was supposed to be one part of what reads as not only one, but several large book projects which were to deal with the German Jewry and anti-Semitism more broadly. The plans were, to say the least, extremely ambitious. The first part was a manual on German Jewry, the second about the entire Jewish history, with a special focus on the paths of suffering, Leidenswege of the German Jews, and the third about the events of the Third Reich, and the fourth a reference book on anti-Semitism. Reading into the agenda and the minute of the meeting of the project, the character of such an endeavor can be described as an attempt to educate Germans about Jewish and German Jewish history. Wiener and Helmut Krausnick, who had been an NSDAP member and who was at the time staff member of the Institute for Contemporary History and would later become its director, were to be personally responsible for the content of the third part of the project. This plan was to deal with the persecution of the Jews in the Third Reich, here already called the Dokumentenwerk. Wiener and Krausnick and several staff members of the involved German state institutions began corresponding about the Dokumentenwerk after this meeting in 1954 and continued to do so for many years. The book was supposed to have several parts. Das Versagen der vielen, the failure of the many, die Bewährung der wenigen, the probation of the few, das Bekenntnis der Schuld, the confession of guilt, and Stimmen der Versöhnung, voices of reconciliation. The chapter on guilt was dropped later on, and a general overview of the persecution was added. Wiener and his colleague Eva Reichmann, who got involved in the planning process at a later stage, also insisted that there would be another part dealing with the unique position of German Jews before National Socialism. Two German Jews were commissioned by Wiener and Krausnick, respectively, to first put together a collection of documents, and as a second step to write the chapters, Eleonore Sterling and Franz Ludwig Carsten. After many years, and because Carsten's manuscript was not deemed fitting for the book, another author was brought in, Hans Mommsen, who would later become one of the most known German historians of his time. He was, like the others, much younger than in this picture. Since the correspondences surrounding the project had so many different actors and institutions involved, I won't be able to summarize all of them today, but I would like to draw your attention to two aspects of the project that I think stand out. First of all, as I said, the Dokumentenwerk can be viewed as a first attempt of Holocaust education. The audience Wiener and Krausnick and the others involved from the federal German institutions had in mind were primarily young Germans, such as students or young teachers, and the language of the book was supposed to be accessible to them. Also, the readers should not be bothered with too many details about the cruelties against Jews, and no general judgment should be made about Germans. It should, in one word, be digestible. Second of all, I think the collection of research material itself is interesting. The documents collected in a folder named Research Material comprise, among other things, eyewitness accounts of Jewish Germans and their experiences during National Socialism and afterwards, starting with the November pogroms, the so-called Reichskristallnacht. But they also comprise so-called perpetrator documents, such as Nazi orders, etc. The result is an eclectic collection of all kinds of different sources. it seems to me that those collecting the material, namely Carsten and Sterling, knew that a single perspective would not suffice to write the history of the persecution of Jews, but that they needed to integrate both material from victim groups and from perpetrators. This approach, I would argue, is close to that of the Jewish historical commissions in Europe. As Laura Jokusch argues, those commissions had in mind an integrated history of the Holocaust long before the term was coined by Saul Friedlander. At the same time, as became apparent over time, writing such a history proved extremely difficult for those involved in the Dokumentenwerk, and I think this leads us to the main reason why the project ultimately failed after many years of work and lengthy negotiations and correspondences. The editors and authors simply did not know what kind of history they wanted to write, although, as we saw, different subjects were assigned to each chapter, they lacked clear research questions and methodology. Instead, their focus was on the facts, Tatsachen. This lack of clear vision, I would argue, was the reason for many difficulties regarding the instructions for the manuscripts and ultimately caused a lot of back and forth and dissatisfaction with them. It shows, and it might sound like a platitude, that documents alone are not enough to write history. To process and write about something so unprecedented as the persecution and ultimately annihilation of the Jews needed not only time, but most importantly, a clear methodological or even theoretical approach. A description of the facts, as they put it, could not do justice to the catastrophic event that we now call the Holocaust. Before coming to the end of my talk, let me share a few thoughts on why I think Wiener agreed to participate in such an ambitious endeavor and contextualize the relationship between Wiener and the Institute for Contemporary History. Wiener was, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, a proud German, and in the 1950s he started traveling to Germany on a regular basis to participate in forums of Jewish-Christian dialogue and so-called reconciliation, mostly invited by church organizations. He became a regular speaker in Germany and took part in many conferences. For his engagement, he received the highest federal German merit of honor, the Bundesverdienstkreuz, in 1955. In a speech at the memorial event shortly after Wiener's death in 1964, his colleague Eva Reichmann described him as the German Jew and made reference to his strong attachment to Germany even after the war. She also described his visits to Germany. Quote, "To him, Wiener, these study groups and weekend conferences in Germany became a revelation. After terrible upheavals, he was, towards the end of his life, once again blessed with a renewal of youth. In the youth that surrounded him, he felt himself reborn. No doubt penetrated into his conviction of the synthesis of German and Jewish ideals, so jubilantly reasserted. Though the world which it had once reflected lay in ruins, shattered beyond resurrection, his life, the life of a German Jew, had come full circle." Unquote. This is a printed version of the text, published 1 year later. I think what motivated Wiener to participate in activities of dialogue and reconciliation was not only his strong belief in the other or good Germany, as he put it. Considering how much joy he felt when talking to young Germans, I believe it was also a way of reconciling his own German Jewish identity. German Jewry had ceased to exist with the Holocaust, but the reintegration of both aspects of his own sense of belonging was to him both a personal and political tikkun. In this context, a cooperation with the Institute for Contemporary History can be seen as another small contribution Wiener hoped to make to repair something that had been destroyed forever. Whereas Wiener seemed to have been enthusiastic about those Germans who were interested in building a different, democratic, good Germany, the staff members of the Institute for Contemporary History, for their part, maintained a somewhat ambivalent stance towards Jews. Nicholas Berg has described the very difficult relationship between the Institute and Joseph Wulf, to a lesser extent H.G. Adler, and later between Martin Brostad and Saul Friedlander. From the sources that I have consulted for the period of my research, I can say that at least partially they had a very keen interest in the cooperation with the few Jews they were in touch with. Wiener is the most striking example, but the Jong, whom I mentioned earlier, also figures prominently in their institute's correspondences. Another example is Chaim Yachiel, historian Leni Yachiel's husband, who established a contact between the institute and Yad Vashem.
Hans Lamm, on the other hand, another German Jew who had survived the Holocaust in exile and himself a historian, tried over and over to establish a close cooperation with the Institute but never succeeded. He did, though, establish a contact with YIVO while he was in New York and assured the staff members there that there were no Nazis at the Institute for Contemporary History. Their correspondence reflects both the suspicion of YIVO and the difficulties Lamm encountered when they found out that some of the staff members indeed were former Nazis. What I think becomes apparent through these examples is that the Institute for Contemporary History needed or wanted Jews that were willing to cooperate with them. I think that to cooperate with Jews was important to their self-image as good Germans and representatives of the new and democratic Germany. At the same time, they did have reservations against Jewish scholars of National Socialism and feared they would be too emotionally involved and could not conduct their research in an objective way. It is remarkable that whenever a Jewish researcher was involved in some project, a second non-Jewish researcher would have to work with them on the subject. That was, as we saw, also the case for the Dokumentenwerk. To conclude my talk, I would like to emphasize how unique both the relationship between the Wiener Library and the Institute for Contemporary History and their common research project, the Dokumentenwerk, was. First of all, their relationship was unique since here a number of Jewish and non-Jewish scholars established close contacts less than a decade after the Holocaust and were eager to collaborate as researchers, exchanging materials, publications, books, etc., but also ideas and opinions. Second of all, the book project they tried to bring to life was unique since its goal was to create a scholarly overview about the persecution of the Jews that would target primarily young Germans and would thus have been a first book on Holocaust education. That it ultimately failed was certainly due to other working obligations of both Wiener and Krausnick, as they said in their letters, and a number of practical difficulties. But mostly, I think it was the lack of perspective on how to write the history of the Holocaust that led to its failure. Many thanks.